In a small roadside diner, an older man with a quiet demeanor sits, sipping his coffee and keeping to himself. Unbeknownst to the rowdy biker gang that walks in, this is no ordinary man. He's a former Marine Corps sniper, a seasoned warrior who has seen and survived things they could never imagine. When the bikers begin mocking him, testing his patience with their disrespect, they have no idea they're about to awaken a force they can't control. What follows is an explosive showdown that will bring their criminal empire to its knees and change the course of their lives forever. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. It was just another quiet morning in the small roadside diner. The kind of place that was a little worn around the edges. Cracked booths, a jukebox playing softly in the corner, and the smell of bacon sizzling on a grill. No one ever came here expecting anything exciting, just a simple meal and a moment of peace on the long, dusty highway. At the far end of the counter, sitting by the window, was an older man. His face was weathered and worn, deep lines carved into his features from years spent under the sun. On the move, living a life most people couldn't fathom. His hands were steady as he held the cup of coffee, his eyes half-lidded, watching the world go by outside. He didn't look like much, just another aging traveler, perhaps. But those who had seen him on the road knew better than to underestimate him. Sergeant Jack Hawk Reynolds had seen more than his fair share of battlefields. A former Marine Corps sniper, he had been through hell and back, survived places where others had fallen. He wasn't here looking for trouble. He wasn't here for the noise or the drama. He just wanted to be left alone. But trouble had a way of finding people like him, especially when it came in the form of a loud, obnoxious biker gang. The door to the diner swung open with a rattle, and in they came. 6 bikers, all dressed in leather jackets emblazoned with the insignia of their gang, the Black Marauders. Their faces were rough, hardened by years of living outside the law, and their voices carried the arrogance of men who thought they could get away with anything. They swaggered to the counter, slamming their hands down on the bar, their laughter booming, drawing the eyes of everyone in the room. The waitress behind the counter, a young woman with a tired smile, gave them a polite nod, already used to the rowdy behavior of bikers who passed through. "Hey, pretty lady," one of them called, a thick-bearded man with tattoos covering his arms. "What's the special today? Or do you just serve up a side of attitude?" The waitress forced a smile. "You're in luck. Special today's the steak and eggs. Comes with a side of hash browns." "Sounds good," he said, turning toward the other bikers. "You guys hear that? Steak and eggs. Let's eat." They plopped down at the counter, filling the place with their brashness. But it wasn't the waitress they were interested in. Their eyes were drawn to the older man sitting at the far end of the counter, his back to them. Hawk didn't look up when they entered. He didn't care. He had been in too many situations like this before to let it bother him. But as the bikers began to get louder, throwing insults and making crude jokes, he couldn't help but notice their presence. They were trying to be intimidating, trying to flex their power in a place that was too small, too quiet for their type. "Look at this old man," one of them sneered, his voice thick with mockery. He was a younger guy, maybe in his late 20s, with a studded leather vest and a patch over his left eye. What's he doing here? Waiting for his retirement check? The others burst into laughter, the sound echoing around the diner. Hawk could feel the tension in the air, thickening with every word they threw his way. They were testing him, seeing if they could get a rise out of him. But Hawk wasn't the type to react to insults. He had been through enough wars and personal battles to know that most of the noise was just that, noise. Still, their laughter grated on his nerves, the kind of annoyance that started to grow like a splinter beneath the skin. "Hey, Grandpa," the young biker continued, leaning across the counter, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What are you doing here all alone? Waiting for your buddy to come pick you up in a wheelchair?" The gang laughed again, their taunts rising to a crescendo as they enjoyed their moment of dominance over the old man. Hawk's fingers tightened slightly around his coffee cup, his knuckles turning white. He could feel his pulse steadying, his body going still. He didn't need to engage. He didn't need to show them how badly they had misjudged him. But something in the air, something about the way they spoke to him, ignited a flame in his chest. He had survived battles where men half his age would have crumbled. He had fought in places where his life had been on the line every day. But the thing about being a sniper, about being trained in the art of patience and precision, was that he could control the urge to strike. He didn't need to throw a punch to make someone regret their actions. He knew exactly how to make them see the consequences of their disrespect. With a calmness that could only come from years of experience, Hawk put down his coffee cup and slowly turned his head toward the bikers. His eyes were cold, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak immediately, letting the tension stretch in the air, letting the silence take root. The young biker leaned in closer, emboldened by the quiet. "What's the matter, old man? You gonna cry about it? Is that what's coming next?" Hawk's voice was low, steady. "You don't know who you're talking to." The gang went silent, the smirk on the young biker's face faltering for a moment. Hawk's words hung in the air like a warning, a threat they couldn't yet understand. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The young biker, his face still twisted in amusement, leaned even closer to Hawk, as if he were daring the old man to make a move. The rest of the gang watched with smirks on their faces, waiting for the inevitable confrontation they thought would unfold. An old man, clearly out of place in their world, either cowering or snapping under their mockery. They couldn't have been more wrong. Hawk's eyes never left the young biker's face as the seconds stretched into an eternity. The diner's atmosphere, once calm and familiar, seemed to quiet down as the tension between the two men thickened, like an invisible storm building up just beneath the surface. The young man's cocky smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered. "Yeah, right, old man," he sneered, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I'm sure you've got some kind of magic trick up your sleeve. Why don't you show us? You got something to prove?" The gang behind him chuckled, egging the confrontation on. But Hawk didn't budge. His body remained relaxed, his posture loose, but there was an unmistakable edge in his gaze that made even the loudest bikers pause. Hawk wasn't a man who relied on cheap tricks. He wasn't going to shout or make a scene. He knew the value of control, the kind of control that came from experience, from years of discipline and hard-earned wisdom. The young biker's voice was getting louder, and a few of the others started to egg him on, their laughter filling the diner. One of the bikers, a large man with a thick neck and a snake tattoo running down his arm, stood up, slamming his fist on the counter. "You're getting too old for this," the large biker said with a menacing grin. "Maybe it's time you took a nap. You can't be a tough guy forever." But Hawk had heard enough. With a fluid motion that belied his age, he stood from his seat, his movement like a coiled spring releasing. His calm expression never wavered as he stepped forward, his boots making barely a sound on the floor as he approached the counter. The large biker stepped closer, expecting to tower over Hawk, but the old man didn't back down. They were nearly face to face now, and the tension between them could be cut with a knife. "You think I'm old?" Hawk asked, his voice soft but cutting through the noise of the gang like a razor. "You think I'm weak?" His eyes scanned the biker's body, his arms, his chest, and a slow, deliberate smirk crept onto Hawk's face. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, but the bikers just laughed again. They weren't intimidated, not yet. They were used to getting what they wanted through fear, through force. Then, without warning, the large biker swung at Hawk. His fist moved with brutal force, but Hawk was already one step ahead. With the same speed and precision that had made him a sniper in his prime, Hawk ducked low, sidestepping the punch with ease. The large biker's momentum carried him forward, and in that split second, Hawk's hand shot out, gripping the biker's wrist in a vice-like hold. It was a move so fast, so smooth, that it was like watching a predator trap its prey. Hawk twisted the biker's wrist, using the biker's own momentum against him, forcing the man down onto the counter with a painful grunt. The bikers froze. The air in the diner grew thick with disbelief. Hawk's grip on the large biker's wrist tightened, and with a cold, steady voice, he said, "You never want to test someone like me. Not here. Not ever." The rest of the gang started moving, trying to process what had just happened. The large biker struggled to free himself, but Hawk's grip was unyielding. There was no sign of panic, no sign of hesitation in the older man's eyes. Hawk was calm, too calm, and the bikers could see that now. They had underestimated him, and that was a mistake they were about to regret. The biker on the far side of the diner, a man with a shaved head and a tattoo of a serpent winding around his neck, reached for his own weapon, a knife. But before he could unsheath it, Hawk released the hold on the large biker's wrist, pushing him back forcefully against the counter. The man stumbled backward, throwing his hands up in confusion and fear. Hawk was already facing the new threat, his eyes locking onto the snake-tattooed biker with deadly precision. Without a word, Hawk took a step forward, his eyes unblinking. The biker hesitated, his hand still hovering near the knife, as if the weapon could somehow give him an edge. But Hawk had already calculated his move. He didn't need a weapon. He didn't need anything other than his hands, his mind, and the instincts that had kept him alive in far more dangerous situations. Hawk moved like a shadow, like something that had been waiting for this moment his entire life. In a blur of motion, Hawk closed the distance between them, grabbing the biker's wrist with the same unrelenting force. The biker's knife dropped to the floor with a clatter. Before the man could react, Hawk had twisted his arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees. The biker's face was contorted in pain, his body trembling as Hawk's grip tightened. "Do you really think you can intimidate me?" Hawk asked, his voice a low growl, his grip never faltering. "Do you really think you can bully people into submission?" The other bikers, stunned by the speed and efficiency with which Hawk had incapacitated their friends, now started to look at each other nervously. The room was tense, the silence punctuated only by the sound of the rattling air conditioning and the faint hum of the jukebox. The gang that had walked in with arrogance was now silent, unsure of what to do next. One of them, a tall biker with a leather vest and a wild look in his eyes, took a step back, his hand reaching for his own weapon. But it was too late. Hawk was already on him, and before the man could even react, the old Marine's fist collided with his jaw with the kind of force that only comes from years of training and battle. The man dropped like a sack of potatoes, unconscious before he hit the floor. The remaining bikers stood frozen, their faces pale. Hawk didn't need to say another word. The message was clear. They were no longer in control. He was. The silence that followed was deafening. The remaining bikers, all still standing but now visibly shaken, exchanged uneasy glances. Hawk, standing in the middle of the diner, was still as a stone, calm, collected, and dangerous. His eyes scanned the group of men, noting the tremors in their hands, the hesitation in their steps. None of them had expected this. They had expected an easy target, someone to mock, someone to push around. Instead, they had met a force unlike anything they had ever faced. The realization that they had underestimated him was sinking in, and the fear was palpable. The tall biker with the wild eyes, the one who had reached for his weapon earlier, stepped forward, his bravado returning, but it was strained now. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a calculated defiance. He reached for the revolver holstered at his side, his fingers trembling slightly. But Hawk was already moving. Before the biker could even pull the gun from its holster, Hawk's hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist in a grip that felt like iron. The biker's eyes widened in surprise, and he instinctively tried to pull back, but Hawk's fingers tightened like a vice, causing the man to gasp in pain. "You're not getting that out," Hawk said coldly, his voice a low growl. His eyes never wavered from the biker's face. "Put it down." The biker struggled for a moment, but Hawk's grip was unbreakable. The pain radiated up his arm, and his hand, which had once been so eager to reach for the weapon, now trembled in Hawk's hold. "You think you're tough?" Hawk continued, his voice gaining a hard edge. "You think you can scare someone like me?" The biker, his face reddened from the pressure on his wrist, gritted his teeth, his breath quickening in a mix of anger and fear. But the more he fought, the tighter Hawk's grip became. Hawk wasn't just strong, he was precise. Every movement was calculated, every inch of pressure applied to keep the man subdued without causing permanent harm. It was a lesson in control. The other bikers were frozen, their minds racing as they tried to process what was happening. They had seen men break under pressure before, seen others panic and flee, but this was different. They were used to being the ones who set the pace. They were used to being the ones in charge. Now, they were the ones being controlled. "You'll get your chance to run," Hawk said, his voice steady as he released the biker's wrist with a final, forceful push. The man stumbled back, nursing his arm, but Hawk wasn't done. "But right now, you're going to listen. Every one of you." The biker who had been mocking Hawk earlier, the young one with the wild grin, was slowly backing up, his hand reaching for a knife on his belt. But Hawk had already anticipated the move. In the blink of an eye, he darted forward, his hand snatching the knife from the biker's belt before the blade could even clear the sheath. The young man gasped in shock as Hawk twisted his arm, forcing him to drop to his knees. "Don't make it worse," Hawk warned him. "I don't need this to end any more violently than it already has." The young biker, now on his knees, looked up at Hawk with wide, fearful eyes. He hadn't expected the old man to be so quick, so capable. The knife was now in Hawk's hand, but Hawk didn't even acknowledge it as a threat. Instead, he held it loosely, almost dismissively. It was a statement more than anything, an assertion of dominance. "You want to take a shot at me?" Hawk continued, his voice low, unbothered. "Then go ahead. But know this, you won't make it." The rest of the gang was starting to realize the situation had shifted in a way they hadn't foreseen. They had thought they could overpower the old man, take control of the diner, and leave with nothing more than a few laughs. But now, they were trapped in their own arrogance. "Stand down now," Hawk ordered, his voice sharp as a whip. His eyes scanned each of them, making sure they understood. "I don't want to have to keep proving myself." For a long moment, no one moved. The biker who had reached for his gun was still standing, his hand hovering near the holster, but Hawk's stare was enough to freeze him in place. One by one, the bikers looked around, assessing the situation, calculating their odds. The diner was too small to run. The door was too far, and Hawk was too close. They were outgunned and outclassed. Finally, the big biker with the snake tattoo, the one who had been most vocal, raised his hands in surrender, his voice gruff. All right, old man. You've made your point." Hawk didn't smile. He didn't need to. "I don't want trouble," he said, his voice firm. "I don't need to be a hero. But if you push me, if you keep pushing me, there's no telling where this will end." The biker with the snake tattoo nodded, his pride visibly bruised but his survival instinct kicking in. He looked to the others, signaling them to stand down. "We're done here," he said, his voice tight with frustration. Hawk didn't lower the knife immediately. He waited, watching the men, ensuring they understood the message. This wasn't about being a hero. It was about respect, and they had crossed a line. With a final glance at the group, Hawk turned toward the counter and slowly sat back down, the knife now resting on the counter in front of him. He took a deep breath, his eyes closed for a moment as he regained his composure. The diner, which had felt on the verge of exploding just moments ago, now seemed oddly calm. The bikers were scattered around, nursing their bruised egos and dealing with the sharp sting of realization. The waitress behind the counter, who had watched the entire scene unfold in stunned silence, now took a cautious step forward, her hand resting on the edge of the counter. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, her voice shaking slightly. Hawk opened his eyes and looked at her. "I'm fine," he said, his tone calm. "Just another day." But as the bikers shuffled out of the diner, their shoulders slumped, and the heavy door creaked shut behind them, they knew that what had just happened wasn't just a chance encounter. They had faced someone they couldn't control, someone who had no place in their criminal world. And they weren't about to forget him anytime soon. Hawk had shown them who was really in charge, and it wasn't them. The door to the diner swung closed with a final, resounding creak, leaving the air behind it thick with the remnants of tension. The bikers had left, their pride shattered, their egos bruised, and their heads likely swirling with confusion and resentment. But inside the diner, Hawk remained unmoved, calm as ever, his eyes scanning the room as if nothing had happened. The waitress, her hands still resting on the edge of the counter, took a cautious step back, her eyes fixed on the old man who had just turned a chaotic confrontation into an undeniable statement of power. She had seen her fair share of troublemakers pass through the diner. Guys who thought they could run the place with their loud voices and sharp insults. But Hawk wasn't like the others. He had handled the situation with the kind of quiet precision that made her uneasy, but also, strangely, relieved. "You sure you're okay?" she asked again, her voice a little less shaky this time. Hawk gave her a small nod, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window. The sky was beginning to darken as the sun sank lower, and the harsh midday light began to soften into the mellow hues of evening. He had dealt with worse, much worse, and in his line of work, a confrontation like that was just another day in the trenches. "I'm fine," he repeated, his voice steady. He took a long, slow sip from his coffee cup, savoring the warmth and the quiet after the storm. "They'll be back, of course. But it's not over yet." The waitress blinked, unsure whether she'd heard him correctly. "What do you mean? They'll come back? After all that?" Hawk didn't look at her as he set the cup down. His mind was already working, already calculating the next steps. He had known that pushing those bikers into submission wouldn't be the end of it. Their pride wouldn't allow it. They were part of something much larger than just a group of loud, rowdy individuals. They were part of a larger criminal network, a criminal empire that had its roots in the underworld and wouldn't tolerate being humiliated in public. Hawk knew what was coming next. "They'll come back, and they'll come back harder," he said, his tone low and almost disinterested, as if the thought of it didn't bother him in the slightest. "When they do, we'll need to be ready." The waitress looked around the diner, her eyes flicking nervously to the cracked booths and the aging decor. It was clear this wasn't the type of place built to withstand a serious confrontation, and Hawk knew that. This wasn't his fight to begin with. But now, it was too personal. He had become a target, and so had the diner, whether it was his choice or not. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the counter as he studied the young woman. "Listen, you've got to get out of here when they come back. If I'm right, and they're part of the Black Marauders, this is no longer just some local trouble. This is bigger. You don't want to get caught in it." The waitress swallowed hard, her gaze flickering toward the door. She had heard of the Black Marauders, of course. Rumors had circulated for years about their illegal activities, their reign of terror across the local community, and their grip on the highways. But she had never seen them up close, never witnessed how dangerous they truly were. Until now. I don't know where I'd go," she said softly, her voice filled with uncertainty. "This place is my life." Hawk could hear the hesitation in her voice, the fear that was starting to creep in. He didn't blame her. The Black Marauders had a way of destroying everything they touched, and this diner, this small oasis of normalcy in a world gone mad, was now at the center of it all. "Get a bag," Hawk said, his voice firm. "Pack your things. Go stay with a friend, somewhere out of the way. Don't wait. It's not safe anymore." The waitress nodded, her mind already spinning with the weight of Hawk's words. But she couldn't ignore the reality that was settling in around her. She could feel the unease spreading throughout the diner, the quiet after the storm. Hawk's prediction was starting to feel more like a certainty. "All right," she said, her voice trembling. "I'll go. But you're really gonna fight them, aren't you?" Hawk's eyes flicked to hers for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I don't fight unless I have to. But they're not going to leave without a reason. And when they come back, it'll be more than just words. They'll come for me, for the diner, and anyone who gets in their way." A moment passed, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The waitress could see the determination in his eyes, the quiet resolve that had once driven him to be a Marine Corps sniper. He wasn't afraid of the Black Marauders, but that didn't mean he was going to let them walk all over him. "You're not alone in this," she said suddenly, her voice stronger now. "You don't have to face them by yourself." Hawk gave her a small smile, his eyes softening just a fraction. He had seen that kind of loyalty before, back in the Corps. People who would stand by you, no matter the odds. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was a roadside diner, and his fight wasn't one he wanted anyone else to be a part of. "You'll be safe," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Just get out of here. I'll handle the rest." The waitress hesitated, then nodded. her expression shifting from fear to something more resolute. She turned to leave, her footsteps quick as she disappeared into the back of the diner to grab her things. Hawk, for his part, remained still, his mind racing with the plans and contingencies that were already forming. The black marauders were coming, and when they did, he would make sure they knew exactly who they were up against. He stood, stretching his back as he looked around the diner one last time. He wasn't going to let this place fall. Not on his watch. The quiet was unsettling now, more so than it had been just a few minutes ago. Hawk knew he had no time to waste. The bikers would be back soon, angrier and more determined than ever. And when they arrived, Hawk would be ready for them. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the community that had been dragged into this conflict, for the diner that had been dragged into his war. He reached for his jacket, slipping it on slowly, deliberately. His hands were steady, his mind calm. There was no room for fear. Not anymore. The black marauders were coming, and they were about to find out exactly who they had messed with. The diner was quiet again, the only sound being the occasional creak of the old stools as Hawk adjusted his posture, waiting. His mind worked with machine-like precision, running through the steps he'd need to take. He had survived far worse than what was coming now. The bikers were angry, their pride wounded, but they had made the mistake of underestimating him, just like so many others before them. As the minutes ticked by, Hawk's thoughts turned to the bikers. He knew their type, loud, brash, and full of swagger. But beneath all that noise, they were predictable. The marauders were a gang, sure, but they were also made up of individuals, each with weaknesses he could exploit. They were accustomed to intimidation, but they hadn't yet learned the hard lesson that not everyone cowered in the face of their threats. Some people were not afraid of them, and Hawk was one of those people. The waitress, her nerves still clearly frayed, came back from the back of the diner, carrying a small bag over her shoulder. She hesitated as she approached the counter, her eyes meeting Hawk's. There was a moment of silent understanding between them. She wasn't just a victim here. She had her own will, her own decision, but she knew Hawk wasn't going to stop until the threat was neutralized. "I'm going," she said softly, her voice shaking slightly. "Thank you for what you did." Hawk nodded, his face calm, but there was a flicker of something. Gratefulness, maybe, or recognition of the strength in her words. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His focus was already on the next part of his plan. "Be safe," he said finally, his voice quiet, but steady. With one last look, she nodded and stepped toward the door, disappearing into the night. The only sound left in the diner was the distant hum of a few trucks passing by on the highway. Hawk exhaled slowly, leaning back in his seat, his eyes narrowing slightly as he listened. He could hear the motorcycles now, distant at first, but growing closer with each passing second. Their engines roared in the distance, the low rumble a clear warning of their approach. Hawk's body tensed, his mind already on high alert. The black marauders were closing in. He stood up, slowly, deliberately, as the sound of the bikers' motorcycles grew louder, the noise now filling the diner. The headlights from the bikes began to illuminate the diner windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Hawk knew this was it. The storm he'd been waiting for was about to break. With a deep breath, he moved toward the door, his boots steady against the cracked floorboards. The world outside was bathed in the harsh, yellow light of the bikers' headlights, their forms silhouetted against the fading sky. They had come back, just as he knew they would. The group had been bold enough to challenge him once, but now they had no idea what they were walking into. Hawk opened the door just enough to get a clear view of the approaching bikers, their engines still revving as they drew closer. He could see the men now, their faces hard with anger and pride, their eyes scanning the diner like predators stalking their prey. They were hungry for revenge. They were ready for a fight. But Hawk was already 2 steps ahead. The first biker, the one who had mocked him the hardest earlier, dismounted his bike with a grin that faltered as he saw Hawk standing in the doorway. His hand went instinctively to the knife at his waist, but before he could even draw it, Hawk's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Come any closer, and you won't leave here walking." The biker froze, his expression turning from confidence to confusion. He had expected an easy victory, He had expected the old man to cower, to back down under the weight of their numbers. But that was the problem. He didn't know who he was dealing with. Hawk stepped into the doorway, his gaze cold as he looked at the group. His presence was commanding, his every move deliberate and controlled. He wasn't just some old man sitting quietly in a diner anymore. He was the one in charge now, and they were about to learn the hard way. The leader of the Marauders, a large man with a thick beard and a skull tattoo on his neck, dismounted and stepped forward, his hands raised in mock surrender. "All right, old man," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "You got a few good licks in, but you're outnumbered. You can't take us all." Hawk's gaze didn't falter. "I don't need to take all of you on. I just need to make sure you remember who runs this highway." His voice was calm, but there was an underlying edge to it, something that made the hairs on the back of the bikers' necks stand up. He wasn't bluffing. The leader chuckled, though it was forced, and glanced at his men. "You really think you're the boss here? Look at you. You're just some washed-up vet." That was all the confirmation Hawk needed. The gang was underestimating him once again, and it would be their downfall. The leader took another step toward Hawk, his eyes narrowing. "You should have just kept your mouth shut, old man. Now we're gonna show you how we do things around here." He motioned for his men to move in. The bikers took a few steps forward, closing the gap between them and Hawk. But that was the moment everything changed. Before the leader could take another step, Hawk moved faster than anyone expected. With a swift motion, he lunged toward the first biker, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it violently. The biker let out a strangled cry, his gun falling to the ground with a loud clatter as Hawk's elbow jabbed into his ribcage. The biker crumpled to the ground, gasping for air, unable to process the speed with which Hawk had neutralized him. The others froze, shock flooding their faces. They hadn't seen it coming. They hadn't expected the old man to move with such fluidity, such precision. But Hawk was already on the next biker, his body a blur as he took out the second man with a swift strike to the throat. The biker gagged, dropping to his knees in shock. The leader of the Marauders gritted his teeth, anger flaring in his eyes. Kill him. But it was too late. Hawk was already moving through them, a force of nature as he took down one biker after another, each strike precise and devastating. The remaining gang members began to scatter, trying to flee, but they were no match for the veteran sniper who had lived through hell and come out stronger for it. The leader reached for his gun, but Hawk was faster. With a sharp movement, he kicked the weapon out of the man's hand, sending it skidding across the diner floor. "Done," Hawk said, his voice quiet as he stood over the defeated bikers. "And next time, you'll know better than to come at me." The leader, breathing heavily, looked up at Hawk with fear in his eyes. He had been humiliated, and his gang had been dismantled in a matter of seconds. Hawk wasn't just some old man in a diner anymore. He was the reckoning. The last of the bikers scrambled to their feet and, without another word, ran for their bikes, their heads low in defeat. Hawk stood tall, watching them flee, knowing this wasn't the last time they would cross paths. But for now, he had sent a message, and it was a message they would never forget. The air in the diner felt thicker now, like the storm that had passed through had left its mark. Hawk stood near the entrance, his breath steady, his gaze fixed on the retreating bikers as they sped off down the highway, their engines growling into the distance. The clattering of their bikes faded, and with it, the tension in the air began to dissipate. The fight was over, for now. Hawk didn't move at first, his body still coiled, waiting for the inevitable return of the Black Marauders. But for a brief moment, he allowed himself to relax. He had delivered the message. They would think twice before coming back. The diner, once filled with the raucous noise of the bikers, was now eerily quiet. The smell of coffee and bacon still lingered in the air, but it felt hollow, distant now. Hawk turned his back on the door, moving toward the counter where the waitress had returned, her hands still trembling slightly. She stood frozen for a moment, watching him, still processing the chaos that had unfolded before her eyes. You really did it," she said, her voice low, but there was a hint of awe in it. Hawk didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly walked back to his seat, his boots thudding softly against the floor as he dropped back down onto the cracked stool. His muscles ached slightly, a reminder of how much effort it had taken to move through the bikers so quickly. He wasn't young anymore. He wasn't the Marine he had once been, but the years of training, the years of surviving in places far more dangerous than this, had given him the skills to neutralize the threat without breaking a sweat. Hawk's hands found the edge of the counter again, and he leaned forward, his eyes fixed on his coffee cup. He didn't need to make a show of it. He wasn't a man who sought attention. All he wanted was to be left alone. The waitress, still processing what had just happened, grabbed a rag and began wiping down the counter, keeping her distance. She glanced up at him once more, still stunned. "Who were those guys?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hawk didn't answer at first. He knew the question was coming. She had to know. Everyone in town had heard the rumors, the whispers about the Black Marauders. The gang wasn't just a bunch of unruly bikers. They were part of something much bigger, something that stretched into the darkest corners of the city and beyond. But Hawk wasn't sure how to explain that to her. "Just some people who don't understand respect," Hawk said quietly, his eyes never leaving his cup. "They've been running this highway for too long." The waitress didn't press him. She had already heard enough, the weight of his words sinking in. He wasn't just talking about bikers who like to cause trouble. He was talking about a criminal empire. A real one. There was a long silence between them, the kind that only comes when something dangerous has just passed through, leaving a lingering tension in its wake. The quiet in the diner was palpable, but it wasn't comfortable. It was the silence that followed the aftermath of a fight. A quiet that reminded everyone involved that nothing would be the same again. Suddenly, the sharp sound of a motorcycle engine pierced the stillness outside. The waitress flinched, her eyes widening as she peered toward the window, watching the shadow of a bike pull into the parking lot. "Are they coming back?" she asked, her voice shaky. Hawk's body immediately went tense again. He knew that the bikers would likely regroup, and when they did, they would be angrier. They wouldn't let this go. They were part of something too big, too dangerous, and they wouldn't let their humiliation slip away so easily. Hawk's eyes narrowed as he watched the silhouette of the biker climb off his motorcycle. It wasn't one of the Marauders. This was someone else. Someone who had been drawn to the aftermath of the fight. Without a word, Hawk stood up again, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't panicked. He never was. But he knew better than to take any chances. His hand instinctively went to the knife on his belt, just in case. The door opened slowly, and the man stepped inside. He was tall, his body lean but muscular, dressed in a long leather coat. His face was covered by a bandana, his eyes dark and calculating. The man didn't look like he belonged to the Black Marauders, but Hawk wasn't willing to take any chances. The man stopped just inside the door, his eyes scanning the diner, taking in the remnants of the fight. The scattered bikers still sprawled out on the floor, the wrecked countertop, the broken chairs. But it wasn't the damage that caught the man's attention. It was Hawk. "You're the one who took down my boys," the stranger said, his voice cold but laced with a hint of amusement. It wasn't a question. He already knew the answer. Hawk didn't flinch. "I don't have any issues with you," he said, his voice steady and calm. "But if you're here to start trouble, you'll get the same thing they did." The man smirked. "You think you can handle me too, old man?" His eyes flickered toward the door, where the sound of more motorcycles had started to fill the air, the rumble unmistakable. "You've got a lot of nerve. The Black Marauders won't take kindly to what you did." Hawk stood still, the tension in his shoulders building, but his mind was as clear as ever. "I didn't start this," he said, "but I'll finish it." The stranger took a step forward, but before he could make another move, a sharp voice broke through the air. "You're outnumbered," the waitress said, her voice suddenly more confident. Hawk glanced over at her, surprised. She was standing tall now, her eyes full of determination. She wasn't backing down. The man hesitated, sensing the change in the air, the rising resolve that filled the small diner. Hawk wasn't alone anymore. He was never truly alone. "I'm not outnumbered," Hawk said, his voice steady and final. "And neither are you." The stranger paused at Hawk's words, a flicker of uncertainty passing over his face. He had expected the old man to be an easy target, another relic from a forgotten time. But Hawk wasn't just any old man, and this was no ordinary fight. This was a battle for survival, for control of the small piece of land that the black marauders thought they owned. And Hawk wasn't about to let them take it. The sound of more motorcycles rolling into the parking lot was unmistakable now. There were at least 3, maybe more, closing in fast. Hawk didn't have much time, but he wasn't worried. He had spent years operating alone, relying on his training and instincts to keep him alive. He had faced far worse than this, and the marauders wouldn't be the ones to break him. He stood still, waiting for the man to make his move. Hawk could feel the tension in the air. He knew that the stranger wasn't alone, that more marauders were coming. But the old Marine sniper wasn't about to be intimidated. He had been in this position countless times before. He knew how to deal with threats like these, and he was ready. The stranger's smirk returned, his eyes glinting with a dangerous edge. "You don't know what you're messing with, old man. The black marauders run this place. We've got the power, the money, and the connections. And you think you can just waltz in here and take that away?" Hawk's eyes remained cold, his expression unchanged. Power isn't about what you have. It's about who you are when it all falls apart. And you're just a bully with a bike. Before the stranger could react, the sound of footsteps approached from behind. The bikers had arrived. 3 more men entered the diner, each one wearing the same black leather jackets with the Marauders' insignia on the back. They weren't laughing now. They weren't joking. They were here to finish what their comrades had started. Hawk stood tall, his hand resting at his side, his body relaxed. He wasn't about to waste energy. He wasn't going to rush into this fight. He was going to let them come to him. "You think you can take all of us down, huh?" one of the new bikers asked, his voice dripping with venom. He was a big man, with a thick neck and tattoos all over his arms. His hands flexed as he cracked his knuckles, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. They had seen Hawk take out 2 of their own in seconds. They weren't sure what kind of man they were dealing with. Hawk looked at the group, his gaze calm and measured. "I don't need to take all of you down. I just need to make sure you understand that this ends now." The tension was thick, suffocating the air. The stranger, now flanked by the other bikers, made a move toward Hawk. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a knife. The glint of steel in the dim light was a signal. It was go time. Hawk didn't hesitate. As the biker lunged at him with the knife, Hawk's body moved with lightning speed. He ducked to the side, using the biker's momentum against him. In one fluid motion, Hawk grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it with brutal force. The knife fell from the biker's hand, clattering to the floor. Before the man could react, Hawk's elbow jabbed into his ribs, sending him flying backward into one of the booths, where he slumped, gasping for air. The remaining bikers froze for a split second, stunned by how quickly their comrade had been dispatched. They hadn't expected the old man to be this fast, this precise. Hawk didn't give them time to regroup. He was already on the next biker. The man with the tattoos stepped forward, swinging a chain. It whipped through the air with a loud crack, aiming for Hawk's head. But the old Marine sniper was already moving, ducking low and rolling to the side, avoiding the swing by inches. He didn't miss a beat, spinning on his heel and sweeping the biker's legs out from under him. The biker hit the floor hard, the chain falling from his hand as he struggled to regain his balance. 1 down, 2 to go. Hawk's eyes flashed toward the last biker, who had drawn a gun. The man raised it quickly, but Hawk had already anticipated the move. Before the gun could fully clear the biker's jacket, Hawk lunged forward. He grabbed the biker's wrist, twisting it with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The gun dropped to the floor with a clatter, and the biker's body was slammed against the counter, the impact knocking the wind out of him. For a moment, the diner was silent again. The bikers, all 3 of them now sprawled on the floor, groaned in pain, their faces pale with shock. The fight had been over before they even realized it. Hawk had moved so quickly, so decisively, that they hadn't even had a chance to think. The stranger, now standing in the corner, watching his gang members crumble, finally spoke, his voice low and full of venom. "You've made a big mistake, old man. The Marauders don't forget. We'll be back. And next time, it won't be so easy." Hawk's expression was unreadable. He didn't respond immediately, but the weight of his silence hung in the air, more threatening than any words could be. "You'll be lucky if I'm still here next time," Hawk said finally, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You don't understand what you're up against. You've already lost." The stranger's face twisted in rage, but he didn't make a move. There was something in Hawk's eyes, something that told him all too clearly that he was out of his depth. The Marauders might have the numbers, the reputation, and the power, but in this moment, they had nothing. "Get out," Hawk said, his voice firm. The bikers hesitated for a moment, but they could see it. The fight was over. Their pride had been shattered. They were beaten, and they knew it. One by one, they slowly stood, groaning in pain, and made their way out of the diner, dragging their wounded pride along with them. The stranger, last in line, shot Hawk a venomous glare as he walked out the door, slamming it behind him. The sound of the motorcycles revving up again filled the air as they drove off into the night. Hawk stood motionless, watching them go. He had sent his message. They had come looking for trouble, and they had found something far different. The diner, once again, returned to a fragile calm. Hawk turned back to the counter, his body still poised and ready. He had won the battle, but the war wasn't over. Not yet. The noise from the motorcycles faded as the black marauders rode off into the distance. The diner stood silent in the wake of the chaos, its neon sign flickering weakly as the evening crept in. Hawk didn't move immediately. He remained at the counter, his hand resting lightly on the edge, his eyes scanning the room for any lingering threats. The air was thick with tension. The waitress, still standing in the back, watched Hawk carefully. The sounds of her soft breathing were the only noise in the room now. She was still processing everything, still trying to come to grips with what had just happened. The fact that Hawk had taken out 5 bikers without even breaking a sweat seemed almost unreal. There had been no panic, no desperation in his movements, just pure, calculated efficiency. To the average person, this would have been a nightmare. To Hawk, it was just another Tuesday. Finally, after a long moment of silence, he turned his head slightly toward the waitress. His eyes were cool, but his voice was calm, almost too calm. "You all right?" he asked, his words simple, but carrying weight. The waitress nodded, her hands shaking slightly as she wiped them on her apron. She had been in this diner for years, serving the same faces, making the same coffee, but nothing had prepared her for a scene like this. Not even close. I think so," she said, her voice shaky but trying to hold it together. "I've never seen anything like that. You're something else." Hawk didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for his coffee cup, taking a slow sip. The taste of it was almost comforting, familiar, but the adrenaline from the fight still buzzed in his veins, making every movement feel sharp and deliberate. "You're safe now," Hawk said after a moment, setting the cup down slowly. He didn't need to reassure her. The diner was secure, at least for now, but he could see the fear still lingering in her eyes, the uncertainty of the situation settling in. She wasn't used to dealing with the aftermath of something like this. She wasn't used to a life of danger. His thoughts drifted briefly to the bikers, now regrouping somewhere in the shadows. The marauders were dangerous. That much was clear. But Hawk knew that they weren't the real threat. No, the real threat lay somewhere deeper in the underworld. The marauders were just the muscle, the low-level foot soldiers in a larger, much darker game. The waitress hesitated before speaking again, her voice quieter now. "Do you think they'll come back?" Hawk didn't immediately answer. He wanted to tell her that it was over, that they'd learned their lesson, but deep down, he knew better. The Black Marauders weren't a group that took their wounds quietly. The sting of what had happened today would only fuel their desire for revenge. They would be back, and they would come with a vengeance. But Hawk wasn't worried. He had been in worse situations before, facing entire armies, working in places where survival depended on a single misstep. The Black Marauders, for all their bluster and firepower, were still just a gang of thugs. They didn't know the kind of man they were dealing with. "They'll be back," Hawk said, his voice calm and measured. "But they won't get far." The waitress was silent for a moment, processing the weight of his words. It was clear she didn't understand the gravity of the situation. She didn't fully grasp the depths of the criminal empire they were dealing with, but that was fine. Hawk didn't expect her to. He wasn't here to explain it all to her. He was here to protect what little peace the town had left. With a long sigh, he stood up from the counter, his movements deliberate and slow. He had things to do, plans to make. He couldn't afford to relax yet. The marauders would regroup, and when they did, they would come back stronger. But Hawk would be ready. "Get yourself out of here," Hawk said, turning toward the back door where the waitress had gone earlier. "Go somewhere safe. This won't be over anytime soon." The waitress hesitated, glancing at Hawk one last time. But she didn't argue. She grabbed her bag, slinging it over her shoulder, and gave him a quick nod. She wasn't exactly sure where she was going, but she wasn't about to stick around here and wait for more trouble to come knocking. "Thanks," she said quietly before disappearing into the back. Hawk stood for a moment, watching her leave, before his attention shifted back to the empty diner. The place was eerily quiet now, the kind of silence that followed something violent. He didn't want to be here when the marauders returned, but he knew there was no place for him to run. This was his fight, and it had only just begun. He moved to the front door and peeked outside, scanning the parking lot, making sure the bikers had gone for good. The sun was low now, just a faint sliver of light disappearing beneath the horizon. But Hawk wasn't looking at the sunset. He was looking at the shadows, the ones that crept across the empty pavement, hiding the true danger waiting just out of sight. The sound of another motorcycle engine in the distance pulled him from his thoughts. The low rumble grew louder, drawing closer to the diner. Hawk tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his waist. He wasn't sure if it was the marauders returning, but he was ready for whatever came next. The engine roared to a stop, and Hawk stepped out of the diner, his hand still hovering over the weapon. He wasn't about to be caught off guard again. Whoever was out there would regret trying to start something on his watch. But when the rider dismounted, Hawk was taken aback. The man was different from the others. He wasn't wearing the same black leather or gang colors. His appearance wasn't intimidating. It was calm, composed. The man pushed back his helmet and revealed his face, a scarred, battle-worn veteran with a weathered expression that mirrored Hawk's own. "Not who I expected," Hawk said, narrowing his eyes as the man approached. The stranger didn't smile. He just glanced over his shoulder at the bike, then back at Hawk, his expression unreadable. "You're Hawk, right?" the man asked. His voice was low, direct. Hawk didn't respond immediately. There were a lot of things this man could be, and none of them were good. "You might want to sit down," the stranger continued, his voice tight. "I think we need to talk." Hawk studied the man carefully. His eyes were sharp, his posture calm, but the way he spoke, direct, with no hesitation, told Hawk this wasn't just some traveler passing through. He had seen enough of this world to recognize the signs. This man wasn't here by accident. The stranger stood a few feet away, his body relaxed but his eyes constantly scanning, sizing up the surroundings. Hawk's instincts were on high alert now. He wasn't dealing with an ordinary civilian. That much was clear. The man was a veteran of something, like Hawk himself, and that made him both an asset and a potential threat. "I don't sit down for just anyone," Hawk said, his voice gravelly from years of keeping his thoughts close. "You're not one of them, are you?" He gestured vaguely toward the direction the marauders had gone. The stranger's lips curled into a small, grim smile. "No, I'm not part of your little biker problem, but you're right. I'm here for a reason. We need to talk, Hawk." Hawk's eyes narrowed. He didn't like this. He didn't like the idea that someone knew his name, especially if they weren't tied to the marauders. The last thing he wanted was to get caught in a new conflict, especially with the gang already gunning for him. "You know my name," Hawk said slowly, his hand resting on the edge of the counter, fingers just inches from the knife he'd left behind earlier. "But I don't know you." The stranger took a step forward, then stopped, allowing the tension to build. His voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it now, as if he knew Hawk could take him down in a heartbeat. "I don't expect you to know me," the stranger said, his voice calm but insistent. "I've been tracking the Black Marauders. They're part of something much bigger, and if you don't act fast, you and your diner are going to be in the middle of something you don't want any part of." Hawk's jaw tightened. His instincts were telling him to be cautious, but curiosity gnawed at him. The marauders weren't just a bunch of unruly bikers. He'd seen the signs of something deeper, a criminal empire stretching beyond the town and into the underworld. But what this man was saying, what he was involved in, seemed to be something else entirely. "All right," Hawk said, his voice low and steady. "You've got my attention. What's going on?" The man stepped closer, his gaze flicking toward the door to make sure no one was listening. He wasn't just talking about the marauders. Hawk could sense that much. "You might not have noticed it yet, but the marauders are tied to a much bigger network," the stranger said, lowering his voice. "They're part of a criminal organization that spans across multiple states, with connections in weapons, trafficking, and even mercenary work. Their main objective isn't just street-level chaos. It's power. And they've been setting up shop in places just like this one. Small towns where they can operate without drawing too much attention. They've got money, muscle, and influence, and anyone who stands in their way gets swept aside." Hawk's expression hardened. He knew the kind of empire the man was describing. He had seen it before. These gangs weren't just a nuisance. They were cancer, spreading from one place to the next, quietly taking over everything in their path. And if he didn't stop them, the marauders would continue to corrupt this town. Maybe more towns after that. "Why come to me?" Hawk asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "You think I'm just some guy who can help you take down a criminal empire?" The man shook his head. "No, I know who you are, Hawk. You're a former sniper. You were in the Marine Corps for decades. You've seen more than your fair share of battlefields. You've killed men who deserved it, and you've saved lives when it counted. You don't get to be a part of something like that without picking up a few tricks along the way. And that's exactly why I need your help. You're a man who can take out an entire gang of marauders and walk away without breaking a sweat. You have the skills to take the fight to them." Hawk stood still, the weight of the stranger's words sinking in. He had never been one for heroics, for being some kind of symbol of resistance. He fought when he had to, and he fought to survive. He wasn't the man who went looking for a cause. But what the stranger was suggesting wasn't about some fleeting battle. This was the fight of his life. "They'll come for you, too," Hawk said, his voice quiet but firm. "Once you start poking the hornet's nest, it's over. They'll hunt you down until you're dead. You know that, right?" The man nodded, his expression grim. "I know, but I'm not here to fight alone. I've been working my way through the local branches, gathering intel. I've made a lot of enemies already, but I need someone like you to help me finish this. We can take down their operation together, cut the head off the snake. If we're going to end this, we need to hit them hard. We need to go after their leadership. That's the only way to cripple them." Hawk was silent for a long moment, his mind working quickly as the pieces fell into place. The marauders were already dangerous, but the idea of going after their entire leadership, taking down their entire operation, was something far bigger than anything he had ever considered. This wasn't just about survival. This was about putting an end to a criminal empire that had poisoned everything in its wake. He let out a long breath, his fingers resting on the counter as his thoughts swirled. He wasn't looking for a fight, but there were times when the fight found you. And when it did, you either stood and faced it, or you watched everything you cared about burn. "All right," Hawk said finally, his voice steady. "You want my help? You've got it. But you're right about one thing. You and I are going to have a target on our backs. And we're not the only ones they'll come for." The stranger's eyes flashed with determination. "I'm ready for that." Hawk nodded. He wasn't sure where this path would lead them, but he was done running. The marauders had already crossed a line when they threatened this town, when they thought they could run roughshod over people who had nothing to do with their criminal empire. They had made it personal, and now Hawk was going to show them just how personal this could get. "We need to move fast," Hawk said, his voice low. "And we need to be smart. These guys won't stop unless we make them." The stranger nodded, his expression hardening with resolve. "Then let's make them regret ever stepping foot in this town." The diner's worn neon sign flickered once more, casting an intermittent glow across the empty parking lot. Hawk turned away from the stranger, his mind already turning over the plan. The quiet had settled again, but in the air, there was a hum of anticipation, an uneasy quiet that spoke of everything about to shift. Hawk wasn't one to jump into something without thinking. The plan had to be sharp, calculated, with precision, just like every mission he had ever undertaken in the Corps. He needed information, and he needed resources. He wasn't going to rush in blindly, not this time. The stranger, who had introduced himself as Kane, watched Hawk carefully. He could sense the weight of the decisions Hawk was making, the careful calculations that were happening behind those stoic eyes. "You've got something in mind, don't you?" Kane asked quietly, stepping toward the counter and taking a seat across from Hawk. Hawk didn't immediately respond. He was too focused, mentally piecing together the strategy he had used countless times in more dangerous, far more hostile environments. There was no room for error. The Marauders had proven they weren't to be underestimated. "First," Hawk said after a moment, "we need to know exactly where their leadership is. We can't just go storming in blind. That's how you get yourself killed." Kane leaned forward, his voice low. "I've been tracking their movements for months. I know where their safe houses are, where they move their operations. The Marauders have one key spot, their headquarters, a place just outside of town. It's a well-guarded compound, but it's not invincible. If we hit them there, we hit them hard." Hawk considered this, the weight of Kane's words sinking in. He had known the Marauders were organized, but a compound was more than he had anticipated. A headquarters meant leadership, meant the core of their criminal empire was stationed there. It was their heart, and if they could take that out, they could destroy everything the Marauders had built. But it wasn't just about taking the compound. It was about ensuring no one else had to suffer in the process. Hawk wasn't a reckless man. He never was. There were civilians in the area, people who were innocent and had nothing to do with the Marauders. He wouldn't risk putting them in the crossfire. "Getting in won't be easy," Hawk muttered, his eyes narrowing as he thought through the logistics. "We need more intel, weak points, blind spots. I want to know every inch of that compound, where their guards are, their rotation schedules, everything. If we don't have a perfect understanding of their operation, we're dead before we even get started." Kane nodded, pulling out a notebook from his jacket pocket. "I've got contacts. People on the inside who can get us the intel we need. But it's risky. I'll need to work quickly. We can't let them know we're coming." Hawk's eyes met Kane's, and there was an understanding between them, unspoken but clear. The kind of understanding that only veterans shared. Time wasn't on their side, but they weren't amateurs. They knew how to make things happen fast, how to strike before their enemies even knew they were there. "We'll split up," Hawk said, his voice suddenly decisive. "I'll hit the compound from the outside. Get eyes on the perimeter, find any blind spots we can exploit. You go inside, work your contacts, get the intel, then report back. Once we have everything we need, we hit them in one fell swoop." Kane nodded. "And if they come at us first, we're ready. I'll take care of anything on the outside. You focus on getting what we need." Kane hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice tight. "Hawk, I've seen what you're capable of, but this is bigger than just one fight. You sure you're ready for this?" Hawk's expression remained steady, unflinching. "I've been ready for years. You don't survive battles like the ones I've seen without getting ready for the fight of your life. This isn't about me. It's about making sure no one else suffers because of these men. This ends now." The resolve in his voice was unmistakable, and Kane didn't doubt it. Hawk had lived through hell, had faced far worse odds, and walked away from it. But what was coming wasn't just another battle. It was the beginning of something that would change the course of everything the Marauders had built. And Hawk was going to make sure they never got the chance to rebuild. They spent the next few minutes planning, going over the details, making sure they were both on the same page. Kane would work quickly, using his connections in the underworld to gather the final pieces of intel they needed. Hawk would set the groundwork for their assault, taking advantage of the night to survey the compound and find the cracks in their security. "I'll be in touch," Kane said, standing up and moving toward the door. "We do this right, and it's over. For good." Hawk nodded, his eyes still focused on the door. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but he had made peace with the path he was on. The Marauders wouldn't walk away from this one, and Hawk would see to it that their empire crumbled under its own weight. As Kane left, Hawk remained standing by the counter, his hand on the knife he had earlier discarded. The diner was empty now, save for the hum of the fridge and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. Hawk exhaled slowly, his mind sharpening, his body coiling in preparation. This wasn't just about stopping a gang. This was about eliminating a threat that had poisoned the streets, had stolen peace from so many, and left a trail of destruction in its wake. Hawk wasn't doing this for glory. He wasn't doing it for recognition. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. And the marauders had picked the wrong man to mess with. Hawk stepped outside, the cool night air hitting his face. The stars above seemed almost distant now, as though the world was holding its breath. This was the moment everything changed. His steps were steady as he moved toward his truck. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he was going to finish this. The night had settled in like a blanket, thick and oppressive, and Hawk was already in motion. The plan was in place. He and Kane would split, working toward a singular goal, taking down the Black Marauders once and for all. But it wasn't going to be easy. It never was. Hawk's truck rumbled down the dirt road toward the compound, the headlights cutting through the night, illuminating nothing but the endless stretches of highway and dense woods that surrounded the place. The compound was nestled just outside of town, tucked in a remote area where no one would bother them. It was the perfect location for the marauders to operate in secret. Hawk knew it, and now he was going to take the fight to their doorstep. He glanced over at the GPS on the dash, checking the last known location of the marauders' safe house. Hawk's fingers tightened on the steering wheel, the familiar feeling of danger creeping in. He had spent years walking into places like this, places filled with enemies, places where you couldn't trust anyone, and where every step had to be calculated with ruthless precision. He wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. He was prepared for it. The plan was simple, but it was dangerous. Hawk would slip in from the outskirts, scout the compound for weak points, and keep an eye on their perimeter. Kane, who had deep contacts in the criminal world, was supposed to gather intel from the inside, finding out the positions of the Marauders' leadership, any extra security, and any potential escape routes they might need. It was a two-man job, but Hawk knew that this wasn't just a job, it was a mission. And when it came to missions like this, he trusted only himself. As he neared the compound, the trees thinned, and the moonlight revealed the sprawling, fortified structure in the distance. Hawk knew that his approach would be watched, even if they didn't know exactly when he would arrive. The Marauders were always on edge, always looking for threats. But Hawk was not a threat they could predict. He had been trained for situations like this, and he was going to show them just how out of their depth they really were. He pulled off the road and parked his truck near the edge of the woods, a safe distance away from the compound. He knew this was a delicate operation. One wrong move, and it could all go south in seconds. He reached for his rifle, checking it one last time, making sure it was loaded and ready for anything. Then, without another word, he stepped out of the truck and into the darkness. The woods were dense, the underbrush thick with leaves and twigs. Every step Hawk took was calculated, his boots making no sound on the forest floor. He knew how to move like a shadow, and he used that to his advantage. The compound was still a good mile away, but Hawk was already thinking ahead. He had scouted the area before, knew the layout, knew the best places to stay hidden and the most likely points of entry. The perimeter of the compound was heavily guarded, with two large fences, one with barbed wire at the top, and watchtowers positioned at strategic points. But Hawk had already mapped it out. He knew the weak spots, the places where the guards didn't pay as much attention, where the security cameras didn't quite reach. He moved like a ghost, slipping between the shadows, finding the best route to infiltrate the compound without being seen. As Hawk reached the first fence, he crouched low, his eyes scanning the area. The guards on the towers were doing their rounds, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, but Hawk knew they wouldn't spot him, not unless they were looking in the right direction. The guards weren't prepared for someone like him, someone who had been trained to move unseen. He quickly scaled the fence, using the tools at his side to cut the barbed wire at the top with surgical precision. The sounds of the night were his only company now. The rustle of the trees, the distant call of an owl, and the soft crunch of the earth beneath his feet. He dropped down silently on the other side of the fence, crouching low as he made his way toward the heart of the compound. The closer he got, the more he could feel the tension in the air. This was the Marauders' base of operations, a place where their power was concentrated. It was the one place they thought was safe, the one place where they believed nothing could touch them. But Hawk knew better. The moment they decided to mess with him, the moment they thought they could intimidate him, they sealed their own fate. He was here to remind them that power wasn't something they could just take. It had to be earned. And they had lost theirs the moment they crossed paths with him. Hawk moved through the shadows, taking note of the guards scattered across the compound. He wasn't in any hurry. There was no need to rush. His goal wasn't to engage in a firefight. It was to gather intel, find the leaders, and make sure everything was in place for the final strike. The Marauders were a well-oiled machine, but Hawk had dealt with machines like theirs before. And when it came down to it, one man who knew how to fight was often all it took to bring that machine to a halt. As he approached the central building of the compound, Hawk's eyes flicked over the security layout he had memorized. The building itself was heavily fortified, with guards stationed at each entry point and a set of security cameras monitoring every corner. It would be tough to get inside without being noticed, but Hawk had never been one to follow the rules. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, silenced pistol, a tool for precision work, just like everything else he carried. He knew he wouldn't need to use it if everything went according to plan, but there was always a chance that the Marauders would try to play their hand first. And Hawk wasn't about to let them make the first move. Hawk moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his body low and his steps light. He had been in situations like this before, where patience was the only thing standing between success and failure. Every sense in his body was heightened as he scanned the compound, the soft rustle of the wind in the trees the only noise in the otherwise silent night. The Marauders might have thought this place was impenetrable, but Hawk knew better. He could feel the eyes of the guards on the perimeter, their flashlights sweeping the darkness as they made their rounds. But Hawk wasn't worried about them. His training had taught him how to anticipate movements, how to blend into his environment. And tonight, the shadows were his allies. As he neared the main building, the heart of the compound, Hawk could see the layout more clearly. There were cameras, guards, and fences designed to keep people out, but Hawk had already studied this place. Every corner, every blind spot, every crack in their security system. It was only a matter of time before he found the opening. He crouched behind a stack of crates, his breath steady, his eyes scanning the compound. The building in front of him was large, made of concrete with metal siding, a stark, cold structure that stood in the center of the compound. It was surrounded by smaller buildings and storage units, but Hawk knew that this was where the Marauder leadership operated. If he could get inside and gather intel on their plans, it would be the first step in taking them down for good. Kane had said the Marauders' leadership was holed up in the building, but Hawk wasn't so sure. He needed confirmation. He needed to know exactly who was inside before he made his move. The guards patrolling the building's entrance seemed lax, their movements predictable. Hawk waited for a few moments, watching their routine, waiting for the perfect time. As one of the guards turned his back, Hawk slipped out from behind the crates, moving swiftly and silently toward the door. He crouched low, using the shadows to his advantage. Every movement was calculated, every breath controlled. He reached the door without a sound. His fingers brushed against the cold metal handle, feeling for any sign of resistance. There was none. The door was unlocked. Inside, the building was dimly lit, the faint hum of machinery in the background. Hawk slid inside, careful to make sure the door didn't creak or make a sound. The interior was a maze of corridors and storage rooms, each one filled with crates and boxes, likely full of illicit goods the Marauders were moving. But Hawk wasn't here for supplies. He was here for information. He moved through the hallways with the same quiet grace, his eyes flicking from side to side as he checked every door, every corner. He didn't know what he was expecting, but his instincts told him to be prepared for anything. The compound was quiet, too quiet, and Hawk could feel it. The same way a predator can feel when something is watching them, waiting. He stopped outside one of the larger rooms, his ears straining for any sounds. There was something about this room. He could feel it. Slowly, he pressed his ear to the door, listening. Voices, low murmurs, muffled but clear enough to make out. Hawk's pulse quickened as he recognized the tone. It was the kind of voice that came from people in power, cold, calculating, authoritative. This was it. This was where the Marauder leadership was. Hawk checked his surroundings one last time before slipping inside. The room was darker than he expected, lit only by the faint glow of a desk lamp and the lights of a few old computers scattered around. The room smelled of stale air, of paperwork and dust. Nothing out of the ordinary, at least not on the surface. But Hawk's eyes immediately went to the group of men standing around a table in the center. They were in their late 40s or 50s, all wearing suits with the Marauder insignia subtly embroidered on their jackets. They didn't look like bikers. They looked like businessmen, dangerous businessmen. Everything's in place, one of them was saying. His voice was smooth, cold. The operation is running smoothly. The shipments are on track, and we've got the city under control. Hawk's mind raced as he listened. This was more than just a gang. It was an organized operation, a criminal empire, just as Kane had said. The Marauders weren't just running drugs. They were involved in every illegal operation imaginable, from trafficking to arms dealing. They had spread their influence through the town, through the state, and maybe even further. These men weren't just criminals. They were businessmen, calculating every move. Another man, one with a salt and pepper beard and sharp eyes, spoke up. The old vet is starting to cause trouble. We need to handle him. We can't let him keep running around poking holes in our plans. The first man, likely the leader, nodded slowly. I'll take care of it. We'll make sure he understands that we're not a group to be trifled with. Hawk's stomach tightened at the mention of him, the implication clear. They knew he was here, and they were planning to send a message. He couldn't let them know he was inside. This meeting was too valuable to be interrupted. He crouched low, moving silently to the side of the room, staying out of sight. He needed to hear more. He needed to know what else they were planning. You're sure we can deal with him? Another man asked, his voice skeptical. He's not just some guy who can be bought off. I've seen what he can do. The leader's response was cold, almost dismissive. We deal with threats, no matter how dangerous. Hawk is no different. We've handled worse. A chill ran down Hawk's spine as the leader stood up, moving toward the window. Make sure it's done quickly. I don't want him to be a problem for us anymore. Hawk didn't need to hear more. The Marauders had no idea who they were dealing with. They were used to intimidating and destroying, but Hawk was the wrong man to underestimate. He wasn't going to let them think they could just take him out like some low-level thug, but they weren't going to be able to reach him. Not yet. Not until he was ready to strike. Hawk slowly backed out of the room, careful not to make a sound. His mind was racing, piecing everything together. The Marauder leadership was here, and they had no idea that the very man they were planning to deal with was already in their midst. It was time to make his move. Hawk's footsteps were like whispers as he retraced his steps through the maze of the compound, his mind racing with everything he had just learned. The Marauder leadership was more organized than he had ever imagined. They were like a well-oiled machine, operating with ruthless precision, orchestrating a criminal empire that spanned far beyond what was visible to the average townsperson. And now, they were aware of him. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that they were already planning his death. Hawk's hand brushed against the wall as he moved through the dimly lit corridors. He didn't make a sound, every movement controlled and calculated. He knew the Marauders had likely increased their security in response to his infiltration, and it wouldn't be long before they realized someone was on the inside. If they were going to send a message, he needed to make sure they couldn't do it first. The door to the room he had just exited creaked softly, and Hawk ducked into a nearby alcove, blending into the shadows. He could hear footsteps approaching, muffled voices, the sound of boots shuffling across the concrete floor. The guards were making their rounds. Hawk held his breath, his body tensing in the darkness, his eyes focused on the entrance to the hallway. The last thing he wanted was for them to find him now. The footsteps grew louder, and Hawk's heart rate increased ever so slightly. He wasn't afraid. He had been in far worse situations, but the sense of urgency was real. Time was running out. The guards rounded the corner and passed by, their attention elsewhere. Hawk waited for a moment, then slipped out of his hiding place, moving with the same quiet precision he had learned in the Corps. He could feel the weight of his mission now. He wasn't just infiltrating a criminal compound anymore. He was up against an empire, and the clock was ticking down. Hawk made his way toward the rear exit of the compound, where he knew the perimeter was weakest. There would be no turning back after this. If he left, There was a chance they might tighten their security even further, and he would have to wait for Kane to gather the remaining intel. If he stayed, however, it could all end tonight. He could make the Marauders regret ever thinking they could cross him. He had the information he needed. He knew their layout, their weaknesses. Now, all he had to do was get out of the building without alerting anyone to his presence. As he approached the back door, Hawk's mind flashed back to the meeting he had overheard. The leader had mentioned something about taking care of him quickly, and that sent a cold shiver through Hawk's spine. They were already making plans to move on him, likely to send a hit squad or launch a full-scale attack to neutralize the threat he posed. But they didn't understand what kind of man they were dealing with. Hawk was no ordinary target. With a deep breath, Hawk pushed open the back door and slipped outside. He stood for a moment, listening to the wind rustle through the trees, the soft chirp of insects, the distant hum of engines. The world felt oddly calm, as if nature was unaware of the violence that was about to unfold. Kane was waiting for him just outside the compound, his motorcycle idling quietly at the edge of the woods. He had been ready for Hawk to come back, but Hawk didn't have time to wait for any more exchanges. It was time to act. "They're planning to move on me," Hawk said, his voice low but urgent. "We don't have much time." Kane's eyes hardened. "I figured as much. They're not the type to let anyone walk away unscathed. But we've got what we need, Hawk. We've got their plans. We know where they're hiding. Now we need to hit them fast. Hit them hard." Hawk nodded. He didn't need to be told twice. His instincts had already kicked in. He had one shot at this, and he wasn't going to waste it. The Marauder leadership had already made the first move. They had underestimated him, and now he was going to show them what it meant to mess with a man like him. "We hit their headquarters now," Hawk said, his voice low and final. "We end it tonight." Kane didn't hesitate. He started his bike and revved the engine, nodding toward Hawk to follow. Hawk swung himself onto his own bike, the engine roaring to life beneath him as they both tore through the night, heading back toward the compound. The Marauders thought they were in control. They thought they could operate from the shadows, pulling the strings of their empire without anyone being able to touch them. But Hawk wasn't just any threat. He wasn't just a lone wolf, waiting to be hunted. He was the one hunting them, and it was about time they realized that. As they approached the compound again, Hawk's eyes scanned the perimeter. He could see the guards on the towers, their flashlights sweeping the darkness, their movements slow and methodical. They were ready for an attack, but they weren't ready for what was coming. Hawk and Kane parked their bikes out of sight, hidden behind a thick patch of trees. Hawk's hand went to his rifle, checking it once more, making sure it was in perfect condition. He could feel the weight of the weapon in his hands, the steady rhythm of his pulse matching the anticipation in his chest. This was it. "We do this clean," Hawk said to Kane, his voice low and purposeful. "We get in, get the intel, take down their leadership. No unnecessary noise." Kane nodded, his eyes locked onto Hawk's. "Understood." They moved swiftly, cutting through the shadows like ghosts. The guards were still unaware of their presence, too caught up in their own routines to notice the quiet footsteps of two men who had been trained to move unnoticed. Hawk led the way, using his knowledge of the compound to navigate through the maze of buildings. They moved past the perimeter, closer to the heart of the operation, where the leadership was housed. Hawk could feel his heart rate steadying, his body alert. He had done this 1,000 times before, except this time, it was personal. They reached the central building, where the leaders of the Marauders were holed up. The doors were locked, but Hawk knew what he needed to do. He had the tools, the skills, and the experience. The building's security system wasn't going to stop him. Kane remained in the shadows, watching for any signs of movement. Hawk slipped inside, his heart pounding in his chest as he made his way to the heart of the compound. This was it, the final move, and the Marauders would never see it coming. The air in the compound was heavy with tension as Hawk crept through the darkened hallways, his senses heightened. Every movement was deliberate, every footfall silent. He had spent enough time in enemy territory to know how to move unseen, how to avoid detection, how to strike when it mattered most. This wasn't a game to him. This was the end of a criminal empire, and he was going to make sure the Marauders knew they had met their match. Kane was close behind, moving just as silently, his presence barely noticeable in the shadows. Hawk trusted him, but he didn't rely on anyone but himself. In this line of work, you couldn't afford to make mistakes. You couldn't afford to trust anyone with your life, not even the people who claimed they were on your side. The central building loomed ahead, its heavy doors standing between them and the leadership of the marauders. Hawk knew they had to be cautious. This was the nerve center of the entire operation. Inside, the men who had orchestrated the chaos in this town, the men who had run drugs, weapons, and people through this compound, were preparing to go to war with him. They wouldn't hesitate to kill him if they had the chance. But Hawk wasn't about to give them that chance. He approached the door, his rifle at the ready, his heart steady. The plan was simple. Get in, take down the leadership, destroy the operation. The rest of the marauders would scatter. And when they did, the law would have no choice but to clean up the mess they'd left behind. Hawk gave Kane a quick glance, a silent signal that he was ready. Kane nodded, his face unreadable as he slid into position beside the door, waiting for Hawk to make the first move. With a sharp breath, Hawk kicked open the door, the force of it knocking it back against the wall. The guards inside didn't have time to react. Before they could even raise their weapons, Hawk was on them, fast, efficient, and deadly. He moved with the precision of a man who had trained for this moment his entire life. The first guard went down with a quick, silent strike to the throat. The second, a burly man with a thick beard, was taken out with a well-placed shot to the chest. The third guard, slower to react, was disarmed and knocked unconscious with a punch that would have left most men on the floor, gasping for air. The room was quiet now, save for the sound of Hawk's breathing, steady and controlled. His eyes flicked around the space, his mind working quickly as he surveyed the scene. There were 3 more men inside, all of them sitting around a table, their eyes narrowing as they took in the 2 intruders. These were the leaders, the ones who had made the decisions, who had plotted and schemed. Hawk wasn't going to give them a chance to escape. He moved swiftly, his rifle raised as he addressed the men at the table. "Stay seated. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The leaders froze, their hands slowly rising from the table. Hawk's words were firm, but there was something in his tone that made them hesitate. They weren't used to being confronted, not like this. They had ruled this place with an iron fist, intimidating anyone who stood in their way. But they weren't dealing with the marauders anymore. They were dealing with a man who had fought and killed to survive, and now it was their turn to face the consequences of their actions. "Who are you?" one of them asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. He was a tall man, older than the others, with graying hair and a scar running down his cheek. His hand hovered near his waist, but Hawk was faster. "Does it matter?" Hawk asked, his voice cold and flat. "You've run this place for far too long. It ends tonight." The tall man seemed to bristle at the words, his eyes flashing with defiance. "You don't know who you're messing with," he said, his voice rising. "The marauders don't just fall. We're everywhere." Hawk's response was swift, his rifle never wavering as he addressed the man directly. "The only thing that's everywhere is your arrogance. And that's what's going to cost you." Without another word, he raised the rifle and fired, the shot echoing through the room with a deafening crack. The man slumped in his chair, blood pooling beneath him as the other 2 leaders stared in stunned silence. "Get up," Hawk said, his voice cold as ice. "The game's over. Now, you're going to take me to your vault. All of it, the money, the weapons, the drugs. We're ending this tonight." The 2 remaining men glanced at each other, fear creeping into their faces. But Hawk could see the realization starting to settle in. They knew there was no escaping this. There was no running, no pleading. The life they had built was crumbling around them, and it was only a matter of time before they would be dragged down with it. "Move," Hawk commanded. One of them, the younger of the 2, stood up hesitantly, his hands shaking. "You'll regret this," he muttered, his voice almost pleading. Hawk didn't flinch. "I've seen worse. Get moving." Kane, who had been standing guard by the door, stepped forward now, his gun raised as he moved to secure the other man. The 2 leaders walked toward the back of the room, their every movement betraying their fear. They had been kings in this world, and now they were nothing more than pawns in Hawk's game. As they reached the back door, Hawk motioned for them to open it. They did, revealing a large vault stacked with crates, money, and stacks of documents. The Marauder Empire's dirty secrets were all here, ready to be exposed for the world to see. Hawk moved quickly, his eyes scanning the vault. "This is where it ends," he muttered. "Everything you've built, gone in a matter of hours." He turned toward the two leaders, who were now watching him with wide eyes, their faces pale. They knew it was over. Hawk had taken their power. He had destroyed everything they had worked for. The door to the vault creaked open, and Hawk stepped inside. It was time to finish this. The vault doors creaked open, revealing the heart of the Marauders' operation. Inside, it was a different world. Stacks of cash, crates filled with unmarked weapons, and documents detailing every shady deal they had made over the years. Hawk could feel the weight of their empire resting in this room. Their power, their influence, their grip on everything. And now, it was all crumbling in front of him. The two Marauder leaders stood behind him, their faces pale, eyes wide with disbelief. The older man, the one who had been so defiant earlier, was now practically shaking. He had known this day would come, but he had never imagined it would be at the hands of a single man. Hawk moved swiftly, his eyes scanning the vault as he sorted through the papers, his fingers brushing over the cash and weapons. He didn't need any of it, not really. What mattered now was the destruction of the Marauders' grip on this town. The rest, money, weapons, documents, was just collateral. One of the leaders, the younger one, spoke up, his voice trembling. "You think this is going to change anything?" He sneered, though there was no confidence left in his words. "We'll just rebuild. We always do." Hawk didn't even look at him as he continued his work, pulling out a handful of documents and setting them aside. "No, you won't," he said coldly. "You're done. Your empire's finished." The younger man's bravado faltered as he realized the truth in Hawk's words. The documents Hawk had gathered, proof of their crimes, were enough to send them all away for a very long time. Their reach might have stretched far, but they were out of luck now. The older man, who had remained silent for most of the exchange, took a step forward, his expression hardening. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into," he warned, his voice low. "You think this is going to end with us? You're making a mistake." Hawk slowly turned to face him, locking eyes with the older Marauder leader. "No," he said flatly. "The mistake was yours when you underestimated me. You thought you could keep getting away with it, but you can't hide anymore. This town belongs to people who live by honor, not thugs who profit from suffering." The silence in the room was heavy, filled with the weight of Hawk's words. The older man took a step back, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fear. He realized in that moment that Hawk wasn't just some old man with a gun. He was something else entirely, and his quiet, calculated vengeance was something the Marauders couldn't stop. Hawk turned back to the documents, pulling out the final pieces of evidence they would need to bring down the Marauders for good. "I'm not here for a fight," Hawk said quietly. "I'm here to end it. You're done." Kane stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room. Hawk could see the quiet satisfaction in Kane's eyes. This had been the goal from the beginning, to dismantle the Marauder Empire and bring it to its knees. They had succeeded. The crime syndicate that had terrorized the town was now exposed, and there was no going back. "Time to finish this," Kane said, his voice steady. Hawk nodded. He had done his part. The Marauders' empire would fall, but there was still the question of how they would deal with the aftermath. They had no idea who would come for them once the authorities got involved. They had no idea just how deep the corruption ran. The older man looked at the younger one, his eyes full of fear. The younger Marauder stepped back, his voice shaky. "You can't take all of us down. We'll fight back. We'll..." Hawk didn't let him finish. The Marauder leader's fate had already been sealed. "Your fight ended the moment you tried to cross me." Hawk moved to the side of the vault, where a heavy bag of cash sat on a nearby table. He opened it, quickly scanning through the bills. Enough money to make anyone's head spin, but none of it mattered now. It was all part of the world the Marauders had created. A world of violence, manipulation, and bloodshed. And it was a world that was about to be obliterated. "Make sure they understand this," Hawk said, his voice cold as he turned to Kane. "We're leaving a message." Kane nodded, pulling out a lighter from his jacket pocket. He stepped forward, flicking it on, and with a quick, purposeful movement, set the stack of documents on fire. The flames licked the edges of the papers as they burned, turning the proof of the marauders' crimes into nothing more than ash. Hawk watched the flames spread, his expression unreadable. He had made his choice, and there was no going back. The marauders would never rise again. Their empire was crumbling, their wealth and power going up in smoke, along with every dirty secret they had hidden. With the documents destroyed, Hawk turned to the remaining marauders. "You've got two options," he said. "You either walk out of here and never show your faces again, or you rot in a cell for the rest of your lives. The choice is yours." The younger marauder, his face pale and his shoulders slumped in defeat, looked over at the older man. They had nothing left. Their empire was gone, and they were powerless to stop it. The older marauder's eyes flicked between Hawk and the ashes of his documents. He opened his mouth to speak, but his words were cut short by a sharp, sudden realization. There was no more power, no more leverage. Everything they had worked for had been dismantled. "We're done," he muttered. Hawk didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The two marauders walked slowly toward the door, their heads low. They knew what was coming. The authorities would be alerted, the pieces of the puzzle would fall into place, and the weight of their crimes would come crashing down on them. As they left the vault, Hawk turned to Kane, his face hardening. "This isn't over yet. We need to make sure they don't rebuild. They'll try, you know." Kane nodded, his jaw clenched. "I'll make sure the pieces fall into place. They won't get the chance." The two men shared a look, one of mutual understanding. The fight had been won, but there was still work to do. The black marauders may have fallen, but the shadows they left behind would require careful attention. Hawk walked toward the door, his hand resting on the rifle at his side. The battle was over, but the war had left its scars, and as long as he was breathing, he would keep fighting. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.